You're listening to a Developer Experience Podcast, a podcast about the experience of being a developer or any technical person. In this episode, I talked to my friend Mike Weinand about the list making that helps him get the things done that he says he will, and the pressures that we put on ourselves to be a reliable person. Thanks for checking it out.
I'm Mike Weinand. I've been coding professionally, I guess, since I was roughly 16. Taught myself to code a little bit before that. My dad was a database administrator for most of my life, so I had computers in the house, played video games throughout. So kind of poked around software for a long time, and then finally, I think rented books from the library. If you can believe that, like that's how we learned how to code HTML. Oh man, there was an HTML site. I can't remember what it is now. There, basically, online tutorials, very simple HTML.
Right.
So I've been, that's kind of where I started. Went to college for software development. Went to a private, basically comp sci only college where I went to school Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. Project-based learning, which was, I think, still is fairly like unique, I think, in the industry. And it was great. Like it was not a typical college experience as far as I'm concerned, and it was very much like on the job training almost. So it was when I went there in this Newmont University, I guess I can drop the name. It was 9 weeks on, 3 weeks off. Every 9-week quarter, you had a different project where it was basically, 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. you were doing project time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, early on, it was a little bit more rudimentary, but the last 2 quarters I was there, it was actually a project sponsored by the company that actually ended up hiring me out of college. And so we were cheap labor for a client that they had doing some ASP.NET web forms application.
Mm-hmm.
So did that for a couple of years. Like I said, they hired me, moved to Texas, spent 3 years down in Texas. A lot of consulting, small firms. I think the company I worked for in Texas maxed out around 15 employees. Ended up moving back home to Wisconsin, getting a job at a company called Centair. That's where I met you.
Yeah.
Centair, was a little bit bigger of a company, but still a small company. It's still small, medium-sized company feel, and it was consulting. So it was 3 to 6 to sometimes 9-month projects. Fair amount of multitasking, jumping between projects. As I changed roles from kind of primarily development to also, it was we called it the Scrum Master role at Centair, but it was it was kind of a lead dev who spent a little bit of time on each projects, or multiple projects. I think 2 to 3 at a time.
Right.
So a lot of jumping back and forth, a lot of context switching, and then ended up working for a startup. I was full-time employee 4 of 5 ultimately for that startup. Wore a lot of hats. Basically responsible for all the software that we wrote, and we had a fairly big application that was developed over time through a couple of kind of consulting companies and contracts, but we had a fairly decent footprint by the time they hired me full time. Ultimately, that startup didn't work out. Ended up doing some kind of 1099 consulting at a larger company. We also overlapped there.
A very short time.
But we worked on the same floor for a while, which was actually kind of surprising given
that was strange.
I think they have 50 floors or so. And then worked for another startup where I got to, actually got in on the ground floor of that one. It had some good funding. I hired a team around me. So I was really the principal developer, which again, a lot of context switching, a lot of wearing a lot of hats. Yeah, as I went along, I guess I feel like I've been writing less and less code, which
Sure.
is not exactly what I set out for, but is certainly still my passion. I guess like I still am very much technically involved. I like solving the or helping solve the bigger technical challenges.
Yeah.
But I always end up getting roped into more of the business side of things and team side of things. As I guess I feel like I can kind of witness team dynamics a little bit and provide my input and
Hmm.
um, I guess help other team members grow and write better code. And then ultimately that startup didn't work out either. um, and now I'm back at I guess I'm back at NM, but you know as a full-time employee, so it's definitely the biggest corporation I've ever worked for.
Right.
Um, you know, actually being a kind of W-2 employee. So that's coming with its own set of interesting new challenges and new things to work out and learn how to be a good employee amongst thousands as opposed to tens or hundreds.
Right. Can you maybe talk about where you are at now with the systems and the tools that you use to manage your time and manage the work that you do?
Yeah, the interesting thing is, so I kind of went through all my history there. My way of working really got set in that first like 10-person dev shop after high school,
Hmm.
consulting company. And I don't remember the specific incident that occurred, but it
Hmm.
was very much me getting yelled at by the president about why I forgot to get something done. And I think he instilled on like carry a notebook everywhere, write things down, and I really like took that to heart. Like I
Yeah.
from then on, it was I always had like a legal pad or a ring notebook
Sure.
where I would just every meeting I'd take notes. Basically every day I'd have this is the to do list for today. Um, and certainly things carried on back and forth, but um, it had a big impact on me of like me wanting to make sure that if I told somebody I would get something done, that I would actually kind of follow through on that. And
Yeah.
um, I think that concept really drives a lot of like me, but both writing things down and having it work out, and also having anxiety when I feel
Yep.
like I'm forgetting something,
Yep.
and I end up searching Slack. Like I know there was something I needed to do and I didn't write it down, and
Yeah.
so like over time I used notebooks for a long time. you know, Experimented with various, note taking apps and things like that in college and post college. But I really did pen and paper for a long time.
Yeah.
And it just mainly because it worked. And like there was something about it being analog that, um, I think there's some area study where like if you actually write something down, like you don't actually have to come back to it. Like the
Right.
act of writing it down gives you the memory.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I think that's played a big role in just kind of what I've done that's worked for me over time. Um, Today, it's basically the same system but in OneNote.
Hmm.
I've got a lot of different sources of work now, and I think that's been one of the things that I've kind of worked to manage over time. Is you know, People ask for things on Slack. Work gets assigned in Jira or Azure DevOps. Like, there's all these tools that like the team uses that are sources of questions and work and follow up and email. And so, like, having my own list that's like independent of anybody else's system or any other list, I feel like has been helpful to me in that I, you know, if I get an input from somewhere, it goes on the list. If it doesn't
Hmm.
make it on the list, I, it's pretty much not going to happen.
Right. It's lost.
Right, exactly. Like it's lost. I I actually had my wife asked me about some post Thanksgiving plans that we talked about with my mom, and it's like I don't know. We didn't write it down. Like I it didn't make it in the calendar. I didn't write it down. Um, and I guess that's the other kind of part of my system is it's either notes for like in a to do list format for today
Hmm.
or it's future calendar entries. Like even if it's not like an actual like event or meeting, it's like I'm blocking off my calendar because I know I have to get XYZ done by this date or sometime in the near future.
Hmm.
So I would say calendar and now digital to do list, but it it's just kind of a daily to do list. And I guess day to day, I certainly look at the prior day's list
Hmm.
and will copy things over if they're still relevant. There's a decent amount of time where the prior day list, things are no longer relevant. They either resolve themselves or aren't as important as they were prior, and so I'll move that over. On the flip side, if I'm working through my day and like I'm not getting anything checked off, sometimes I'll just add an item that like I already did just to get like
Yeah.
something checked, right? Like there's that like momentum snowball effect of like getting tasks done.
Right.
Because yeah, I mean it can be really demotivating if you just see a big list of things that aren't checked. And so I think like the prioritization mechanism that I tend to use is like if it's easy and I can get it done in a couple of minutes, that usually ends up going to the top. Like I just want to clear it off my plate.
Hmm.
And I think that happens a lot when people ask me things like kind of informally, whether
Yeah.
it be Slack or email. It's like I've already context switched to like read this message. I'm just going to take care of it because if I put it on my list and have to come back to it later, I'm going to have to switch more than the once I already did.
Right.
And so, um, yeah, I think that mechanism of prioritization. I also think that that context switching aspect, as my roles have changed and as I've been less focused on kind of one project and honestly been in way more meetings,
Hmm.
the context switching is just like built in the way that I if I have a more than an hour of like free time, I almost don't know what to do. Like
Hmm.
I will look at my to-do list and it's still the like, okay, I'm going to try to get the easy things done, get them off. But certainly when there's like larger things to do, I've almost lost the ability to like sit and focus. And I think that's one of
Yeah.
the things like, I'm starting to actually have like more anxiety about that and like how to get back to that focus and flow.
Hmm.
Um, because I used to be able to do that. I used to be able to
Right.
sit down and like just get work done. Um, but my day is so chunked up now where it's kind of few and far between.
Hmm. Do you do any like batching of your time intentionally? So like trying to arrange blocks on your calendar or anything like that?
Every once in a while, and I know it's been like recommended to me. So
Hmm.
actually, for a while at my current position, I was feeling this early on, and I asked to get Mondays and Fridays. Like I'm going to block my calendar. Please don't schedule meetings. I'm going to like schedule this as work time. And unfortunately, it wasn't really like followed. Like it wasn't respected. And the thing is, or at least the thing about me is, I want to be involved, right? Like
Hmm.
I don't like not being at the table when
Yeah.
decisions are getting made. Just because I it helps me personally, especially on when we're solving business problems with technology. Like I want to know what the problem the business is trying to solve is. Like I want to know what the context is.
Hmm.
Uh, and if you make a decision for me, I kind of want you to give me some of the steps you did. And it's like a weird second guessing that I do of other people's stuff. And
I think
yeah,
that's actually probably pretty typical for people in general, and especially like very analytical people.
right. And it's like it's not that I don't trust you, but I'm trying to verify.
Yeah. Yep.
um, and so yeah, I've certainly tried. Like I've mentioned, certainly if I have to get something done, I will put it on my calendar. But when the suggestion comes in, it's like, well, I blocked my calendar. Well, why didn't you decline these meetings? It's like, well, I felt like if I did, then I wouldn't have been involved in all the discussions and decisions that were made during this meeting.
Hmm.
So it's like I don't want to exclude myself from like you're still going to have the meeting even if I just decline it. So
Right.
I should probably be there because you're going to have to fill me in afterward anyway.
Right. And I'm gonna maybe question how you got there.
Right. Exactly. So it's um, there's definitely a meeting culture where I'm at now.
Hmm.
When I've been at other places, um, certainly where I've been at startups and I've had a lot more influence, or even smaller companies. Some things that have worked really well for me are, all right, we're going to have meetings in the morning, and the afternoons are going to be, like only meet if absolutely necessary.
Hmm.
And I feel like things like that have worked out well, where it's like it can't just be me amongst the team trying to set my calendar like that, or at least that's how I feel. Um, but if we have team buy-in, then it feels a lot easier to try to separate that focus time.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's become more complicated by my current situation.
Hmm. I feel what you're saying about the meetings. Like it's a little bit different for me, in that it's not that I want to be in those meetings to be involved in the decisions. It's more just like I really value a lot of discussions that happen in
Sure.
meetings, and I value the connection that happens there, which sometimes it's not very good connection, very not high quality, but it's enough that I think it's important, and um, I end up also opting myself into meetings that it'd be a lot easier if I didn't. It'd give me a lot more time for focus. The anxiety that comes around the inability to focus. I'm curious if there's also like an anxiety about the problems themselves. So like generally when I think about the reason you need focus time is because you're solving like deeper problems or bigger problems. And if you're feeling like these problems are too big or too broad or too deep, I guess I'm just wondering if like that's also part of what makes you uncomfortable about it.
Yeah, I think I identify with that. I think for me personally, um, I end up writing a lot of stories and
Like user stories.
user
Okay.
stories and backlog items. And for me, I am I I like separating things, right? If I
Hmm.
can break down a problem and deal with, the individual pieces of it, that's where I feel much more comfortable.
Hmm.
Um I certainly feel like if we're attacking a large problem, like it there's there's just so much complexity that there's the potential to have if you don't break things down.
Hmm.
Um, and that's not to say that you don't think about the full like context of what you're trying to accomplish, but if you like, I've always found like breaking things down into bite-sized chunks. Like let's solve. one problem at a time. Yeah, because I think part of it is like you recognize that you solve problem one and you find one B and one C. And so like if you try to solve it all up front,
Hmm.
you end up with like you spent a bunch of time and energy solving problems that may or may not actually come into fruition. And
Right.
then the opposite, where you don't recognize half the problems and that will come up that couldn't have been foreseen. And
Hmm.
so you mentioned the anxiety about big problems. Yeah, I think breaking them down has always been part of how I've approached them. Um,
Hmm.
but I've also had a lot of feedback on teams that I've worked with where they don't want to get super fine grained um, on some of the details. Like if the story doesn't tell the full picture or only has a piece, like, and this may be a communication issue more than other things. Like I guess the interesting thing is, as I'm verbalizing this, I'm realizing like part of like my wanting to be in the meetings
Hmm.
to understand the full context and make sure I agree with the problem is probably part of the reason that people don't want to get stories where it's just like one little slice. Because if it doesn't help them see the full picture,
Yeah, exactly.
they want that context.
Exactly.
That's hmm. Thank you for being my therapist.
Just doing my best. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Somewhat separate tangent, and I don't know if you experience this, but at least in software development, there's so many problems that are like better spent like in front of the whiteboard and just
Yeah.
like even I tend to go for a lot of walks during the day where like
Yeah.
I'm not in front of the computer, like I'm kind of only tangentially thinking about the problem, but like I feel like that's some of the most effective problem solving I get.
Yeah. Definitely.
And like there's this weird like I think part of it is some of the remote nature maybe, and some of it is like having that, you know, when you're at the office, you're in front of your desk, but finding that like I solve a bunch of problems not in front of my computer, like only a smaller portion of my job is actually either writing code or writing stories.
Hmm.
Um, it's really the thinking part, and sometimes thinking isn't best done in my basement dungeon without any sun. It
Not much is best done down there.
right. Um,
Yeah, I definitely find the same. And I do think that's the case with a lot of this knowledge work stuff that it's one of the big reasons that I said to you earlier that I don't think I'll ever work in an office again. I just really like being remote because I like being able to walk upstairs to take a break and honestly like just stare outside
yep.
or like eat a bowl of chips or something and not really and listen to NPR or just do things that don't look like I'm if
Yep.
if according to some archaic uh, perception of what work is doesn't look like I'm working, but in reality, like I'm working. Then I'm also working after I've signed off my computer. When I'm
Sitting on the
sitting watching
couch.
TV
Yeah.
or I'm having a conversation with somebody. Like I'm sure this drives my wife mad, but like I may not be fully tuned into the conversation that we're having because I'm actually like processing a problem that I was dealing with that day.
I've I mentioned some random anxieties. Like if I'm if I'm really stuck on a problem, I've
Mhm.
had numerous occasions, and I have, as far as I can tell, I have no control over it. But I'll wake up at 3 a.m. and like have like an
Mhm.
epiphany moment
Yeah.
almost, and like I have to go like write it down. Like
Yeah, for sure.
I get out of bed, go turn on my computer, all groggy, and like start just writing notes down,
Mhm.
and it's it's not enjoyable. Like I don't look forward to these moments, right? Because it just throws off your day.
Yeah,
But
right.
um, you know, I'm working while I'm sleeping.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you get really excited about the fact that you just solved something and you've got this little bit of rush
Right.
and you're not falling asleep for another hour or so.
Right. But
Uh,
thankfully, it's 3 a.m. and you're not going to get distracted by anything else.
yeah, for sure. My favorite time for problem solving is the moments before I fall asleep
Hmm.
or the moments after I wake up where I haven't fully woken up, where you can actually just feel your brain doing weird things. You can feel yourself thinking weird thoughts. And that's a big part of the problem solving is allowing your brain to just go explore things that if you were staring at the computer thinking about this problem, you
Yeah.
wouldn't let your brain go there. You'd be like, no, that's not it. It's
Y-
clearly not that. It's clearly related to this other thing, but you let it just go on its own and it starts to just make weird connections and arrange things very differently than you would do when you were wide awake. And I love that. I love that time. And I feel like it's some of the best time for me to solve problems.
Yeah. I think, you know, one of the things about this job and career that you come to realize is there's literally a million ways you can solve the same problem. It's just
Yep.
a multitude of trade offs for is it the right solution for your current problem?
Hmm.
And you mentioned earlier about, going in meetings to, share ideas and talk through things. And I think those are some of the most effective meetings where, you propose an idea, propose a solution, and you kind of run the gamut of like, does this actually fit these 20 use cases?
Hmm.
Is this the right thing for this situation? Like, let's go through, you know, examples of things that fit and ideally things that don't fit. And then
Hmm.
I think that helps you determine, you know, if the things that don't fit are a big enough problem, well, you probably don't have your problem solved. But if the things that don't fit are like, okay, like those seem like small issues, we can maybe try to fit that in a different way, but we can push that problem down the line. I think that's where we can, as developers, and you mentioned knowledge workers. I think that's where you can really get stuff done and leverage kind of the hive mind of,
Hmm.
if you're on a really good team that people aren't afraid to try to shoot stuff down. It can be really a really effective way to work.
Yeah. What you were talking about earlier about wanting to break down problems, I think that really relates directly to the lists that you make. You know what I mean? Like I think you're breaking down, maybe not a specific coding problem or something like that, but you're breaking things down into bite-sized chunks that you can check off of a list.
Well, I mentioned the like putting stuff on the list that I can check off right away to feel like I'm
Yeah.
getting stuff done. I
Yep.
do the same thing with bigger items on the list. Like I will
Hmm.
often start to make a sub list for the bigger item because like if you have a huge item, it's like I don't even know where to start.
Hmm.
And I only have an hour and a half before my next meeting. So like I gotta get some progress here. So what are the actual like individual steps to getting this done?
Hmm.
And once I outline those, then it's like, okay, like here's this top item. I can solve this. I can move this forward. I was gonna pull up an example from, yeah. So like I got this example of like something I was trying to figure out the other day of we've got to migrate some data from database A to database B.
Hmm.
Pretty standard ETL problem solving thing, right? It's not a huge problem. It's been solved a million times before. Um, but like again, like with my day being broken up fairly frequently, it's like, all right, like what are the actual sub steps to like get
Hmm.
this done? And now where I'm like writing less code myself, I'm also trying to break this into things I can hand off to the team. And so I feel like part of like my breakdown of thinking through the problem also almost directly translates to like individual like acceptance criteria and like pieces of these stories that um, ultimately the team can pick up and work on.
What you were saying about taking those big things and breaking them down, and adding the things that you've like kind of like you've already made progress on this problem, but you didn't break it down before you started making progress, and so then you go back and you're like, oh, well, the first three steps of this thing are this, this, and this, and I already did those, so check those off right away,
Right.
and then add more on top of it. For me, there's a whole lot of emotional, psychological stuff that happens when I don't do that, where I often it happens to me on a regular basis where I just feel like I'm in a bad mood, or I feel like I'm in a bad place, or I'm not productive, I'm not really doing a good job, not able to focus, and I don't really know what I'm doing. And so many times I've had this realization where I'm like, okay, this is another situation where I had a really, really big nebulous problem and I didn't break it down. So I'm staring at my to-do list and I have one big thing and it's impossible to check it off right now. It's going to take me days to check this off. So until I actually go in and add those individual subtasks and break it down a little bit further, I'm going to keep feeling like this because I don't get to check things off. And that checking off of boxes has such a huge positive effect emotionally and psychologically on me. And I think everybody with like a hit of dopamine or something that happens when you check off that item.
Yeah.
I was curious if you could maybe talk a little bit more um, about that like psychological and emotional side of this. Like, are there any thoughts that you have in regards to how does it make you feel when things are going well? How does it make you feel when things aren't going well, etc.?
Yeah, there's this weird there's this psychological like feeling where I feel like if I if I'm not getting stuff done, I'm I'm like I'm not I'm not worthy. There's that imposter syndrome. It's
Yeah,
like the
I'm not
like
contributing.
yeah, that oh man, that's a good way to put it, right? Like the feeling that I'm like failing my team, I'm not pulling my weight,
Mm-hmm.
and that's rough. Like
Yeah.
it's it can be easy to like steer into that rut, and especially when I mentioned the like trying to like pride myself on being dependable and getting stuff done for people. um when it feels like I'm not making any progress,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm failing at that goal.
Yep.
And it's that that's where it's easy for me to also like throw my hands up and go for the walk, where like I know I'm
Right.
not getting any work done on this walk. Like it's like it's like positive and negative feedback loops, right? So like if I recognize I'm on that negative feedback loop,
Mm-hmm.
and you know I think like you mentioned, where it's even just injecting some like, okay, I'm getting stuff done, like I'm just going to go make sure I get all my emails marked to red, or like
Mm-hmm.
clear my inbox. Like pick something easy and like get back into that positive loop where it's like, okay, like I can start building some momentum here and getting back to the like getting things done. And it's trying to pinpoint like psychologically, like the man, yeah, that feeling of like letting people down and not pulling your weight is brutal. And
Yeah, Mike, I have a lot of thoughts about that. Dependability is a it's it's a it's a hell of a trait, uh, and it's there's so much pressure that goes with it, with
yeah,
feeling dependable, and not wanting to let everyone else down. And I have that I defined myself as a dependable person for a very, very long time, and it was just so much more to worry about, because it's not just like I need to be good enough for myself, I need to be good enough for everybody else. And that's rough.
yeah.
That's so hard to do.
and I I had this conversation with my wife earlier today, actually, and it was just about like, is this is this pressure I'm just putting on myself? Like, is this
Hmm.
actually pressure that anybody else
Yep.
is putting on me, or is it just my interpretation of like what I need to be doing?
Yeah.
And like, it probably is mostly just me, right? Like
Yeah.
it, and that's and like recognizing that and freeing yourself from that burden are two
Hmm.
different things.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
um, yeah, that's interesting. I think part of my problem is I also tend to be a yes man
Hmm.
in that I am more agreeable than I should be when
Hmm.
like I I don't say no often enough when people ask. And I think there's something about the thrill of the pressure, maybe like you mentioned the dopamine hit of getting things done. I think there's also like the weird like procrastination effect of like this isn't this isn't fun until it's due tomorrow. And now that it's due tomorrow, I'm going to get it done.
Right. I'm super interested in it all of a sudden.
So there's a lot of weird things working for and against trying to get work done.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, and the more you say yes, and the more things you have to add to your list. That I
Right.
mean, yeah, like you said,
It,
like it becomes more urgent, and you get to it more quickly. But also, that's a lot more things that'll eventually fall off.
and you prove dependable, people will keep pushing, and like I don't think they mean to, right? Like they
Right.
don't like. um yeah, I think we talked a little bit about before we started recording is, some of the deadlines in my current position are mostly self
Yep.
inflicted on
Yep.
us. And sure, certainly everybody would love to get more work done sooner, like that goes without saying.
Hmm.
But I feel like there's a certain point where the pressure of the deadline causes you to make mistakes that are more costly than if
Yep.
you know my opinion, and granted this is my opinion as a, being on the technology side and particularly like on consulting sides too, right? It's like, um people always want to know when something's going to get done, like that. I don't blame any funder of somebody who's requesting software.
Hmm.
um they want to know when it's going to get done, how much it's going to cost. I understand that completely. But I also, it you know it's the, there's the quality pyramid, right? Like
Hmm.
the speed, quality, cost triangle, or there's got to be a better name for that by now. But um, if you set a deadline, I'm going to tell you how much work I think I can get done by that. But you can't set a deadline and a scope
Right.
and expect that to work out okay.
Right.
And still going to try. Like I'm going to do my best, but like I would really much rather being involved in the like, all right, one of these two things is more fixed than the other. Is it the time aspect? Then cool. I can give you a more realistic estimate of, this body of work when it will get done. Or is it the, this is the scope estimate more flexible? Like if you want to go live by this date, I can tell you what we can fit in by then.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think it's a give and take. The farther you get out, the bigger the problem is, the wider your range of estimates are going to be. Um, but I think there's that other aspect of not feeling like I participated in the like pressure uh, that I signed up for is also its own like level of anxiety, right?
Yeah,
Like it
definitely.
it it's you're given an impossible, a seemingly impossible task. I'm still going to try, and then I'm still going to put that pressure on myself, and you like the business and like the people who are asking probably would actually be more open to like, okay, let's actually like let's negotiate over this more, as opposed to me just like kind of taking it in and putting the pressure on myself like, okay, we're gonna I guess we'll figure it out.
Yeah. It's nice to have that feeling that you have agency, or you have some sort of like some, if you do indeed have to do that work in that time frame, to know that you were involved in that decision, and like you accepted it.
Right.
You accepted whatever the pain was that was going to come, as you were involved in making the call.
Yeah, I really burned myself out in 2020 going into the kind of work from home pandemic, but I felt like it was the right thing to do at the time, and like I still would probably do it again, but we were in a small startup, pretty much running out of funding, but also getting our first like actual product that people were paying for.
Mhm.
So it was like, if there's ever a time to kind of really push on the gas and overload myself, like now is it. Um, and I probably overdid it. I should have taken the couple of vacations that I skipped. And granted, at the time, vacation would have been staying home. We had a Disney vacation that Disney wasn't even open, so there wasn't no, it was no longer an option.
Mhm.
Um, but I think there's accepting the pressure, and you mentioned having the agency to like kind of being fully having the full like context and background. I didn't ask anybody else on the team to put in any extra. I do feel strongly that people need to make those decisions for themselves, and also on the flip side, if somebody on my team, like if I recognize somebody's burning out, like to push back, right? Like it's or to pull back. Like
Yeah,
it's not worth it to to
to break them.
right, exactly. Um, you know, you can push for a little while,
Mhm.
but it's not one. It's not healthy for people. It's not healthy for relationships. It's not healthy for um, the we mentioned the dependability aspect, but like I believe strongly where if you go from a normal 40-hour a week and then all of a sudden you work 60 and people get used to how much work you get done on 60, you can almost never get that back unless like up front going into it you're like,
Yeah.
this is extra, like this is not
Yeah.
normal, this is not our team's velocity,
Yeah,
like we're pushing, and I expect to have like free 3 weeks off after this period, right?
for
Like
sure.
um it's well, it's a tough thing. It's just kind of team getting software written, getting software done. Those estimates are always hard. They're
Mhm.
always wide ranging, and the more variables you put in, the less less close you're going to be.
Yeah, definitely. It's fun to think about all these, like all the different pressures that
Yeah,
are going on in many different directions, like the internal pressures that you're applying to yourself, and the pressures that you're feeling from your team, and maybe giving to your team, and the pressure from the business, and all of that stuff. Like how do we even survive all of this? Who knows?
unfortunately, with vices.
Yeah, that's probably true. And a lot of us don't survive this. Are there any conditions under which you stop using the systems at work for you? Like, I can imagine that it could go either way. Like, it might be that when things are really stressful, you drop it because you feel like you don't have time for it, or it could be the opposite. When things are going really well, you feel like you don't need it.
Yeah, I definitely. I think it's more the negative case. Like, and
Hmm.
honestly, like, it's interesting. The last couple of weeks, so first week of November, I had training, and so like I took a bunch of notes during training, but like I kind of just left the to-do list by the wayside because I didn't really have any to-dos other than attend this training.
Hmm.
And when I got back the next week, it was like the first couple of days, I didn't even start a list that day. Like I
Hmm.
was like out of practice
Yeah.
and like almost lazy about it. Um, so I certainly kind of ebb and flow. Just like I think the ebb and flow of you know productivity, I guess, or like actually checking things off. Where I don't know if it's correlated with like the stress or the workload or not.
Hmm.
Um, it certainly could be. I guess I just said I don't have I don't have any empirical evidence to say one way or the other. But there's certainly times where I get less specific on the to-do list or it's less detailed.
Hmm.
Um, and certainly that those could be times where, like you mentioned, there's things are flowing well, there's less stress, um, potentially less being asked, like where I mentioned having multiple sources of kind of inputs to my list.
Hmm.
If the only real kind of like to-do item I have on a particular day is the Jira ticket that's assigned to me, and we talked about it in stand up, I feel like I don't need the reminder of the list so
Yep.
much.
Yep.
Um, so I tend to potentially take alternate paths if I'm not getting a lot of things asked. I think it's more where if all of a sudden I'm fielding 10 questions and they're clearly things that I can't get done in that kind of immediate like 5 minute context interruption, that's where I start to like, okay, I got to start writing this down because I know I'm going to forget. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, it ebbs and flows.
It's nice that you're able to recognize it in that moment, and recognize it as a time when you need to actually jump back in to whatever that system was, versus not even really knowing that you were. I mean, and maybe there is some of that, like that you're not really aware that you're not keeping track of things, but uh, being able to recognize it quickly and adapt, and then and then get back on the wagon, um, seems like it's honestly kind of a superpower.
it well, it I think it helps that I've trained myself fairly well where
Yeah.
when I get that initial input of like there's something I have to do, if I don't handle it immediately, I gotta put it somewhere that I know
Yep.
it's gonna remind me.
Yep.
Now, a lot of times it's the list, but sometimes it's like Slack has this feature that I discovered a couple of weeks ago to remind me.
That's
And
so
so
great.
like I'll set a reminder for an hour or 3 hours, and like I think part of the reason I may have gone lax the last couple of weeks, other than the kind of the work interruption, was like I started leaning more into the Slack
Hmm.
method
Hmm.
of anything that comes in Slack, I'm just gonna have Slackbot remind me. Um, Granted, I, I also then get the like here's 20 Slackbot reminders, and I feel like it's less easy to like kind of navigate it,
Yeah.
and so that's where I'll then revert back to like okay, like I'll, I'll even take like a Slack link or like a Jira ticket link and put it in the list.
Yeah.
Because the list is just a pointer, right? It's just
Right. For sure.
how do I get back into this context?
Yeah. I'm not sure if this is what you mean in regards to Slack reminders, but one of the tools that I've been using lately is when you see a message that it wasn't from you, that and you maybe don't want to know about it right then, you can like click on the um, snowman or whatever the dot dot dot
Yep.
thing is in that case, and say remind me about this particular message tomorrow.
Yes.
Is that how
That's
you mean?
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
That or because I know there's also, you can actually just like say Slack remind me to do this, like type that in and it'll.
No, yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely mean the particular message context
Yep.
menu.
Yeah. 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 The thing I like about that is setting the ability to set boundaries, time boundaries, or like work life boundaries. To
Yeah,
say, I'm signing off and I get this message, I'm not going to look at it right now. But I already marked it as read, so just remind me about it tomorrow, and then I'll deal with it.
yeah. Well, I think that's now that I use this feature, I
Hmm.
feel more open to, like, if I see that, like, that little badge next to a channel, to go into it.
Hmm.
But the thing that I recognized that I was the reason I'm glad I found this feature is, like, I would go into a channel or a direct message thread, read something, file it away. It didn't end up on the list, and then it'd be like, I'd come back 30 minutes later and go, I know something in here, something in Slack
Yep.
I need to do, but I
Right.
don't remember.
And you've got that anxiety again of like, what
Right,
did I lose? What did I drop?
right. It's around here somewhere, and then, like,
Yep.
Slack search is okay, but there's millions of messages, right?
Yeah,
Like,
for
it's
sure. It's too
so
much.
noisy.
Too much.
We mentioned the Slack ones, and it's interesting that you mentioned the. It sounds like there's like a slash remind feature in Slack, and that
Yes.
would
Yep. That's
be
exactly right.
pretty neat. I know for, like, my personal life, I end up using Siri a ton, so, like,
Hmm.
I can. So I've got a bunch of home pods, and I can tell Siri to remind me to do something, and then it shows up on my phone's list. So
Hmm.
you mentioned the work-life balance, and I I definitely keep those things separate. Like, my personal life is in Apple reminders. Like, I'm bought into the Apple ecosystem now. My work life is, primarily OneNote and, like, Slack, and so the things that I can segregate and shut off when I'm not wanting to be interrupted by those by that.
Yeah.
So it's like similar systems, but different technologies, and, like, just completely different context.
Yeah. It is interesting. There was something early on when you were talking about writing things down on paper. I was thinking about how that's like the ultimate solution in terms of portability and
Yeah.
cross platform. You know what I mean? Like you have that notebook,
I,
whatever context you're in. So it's interesting to hear you describe this now, where you actually have a separation in those contexts between home and work.
yeah, I'm pretty sure part of this file cabinet that's sitting next to me is just old, like, work jotted notebooks. Although, like, I think to your point, like, the work legal pad or notebook I would have would often stay at work, or, be in my,
Yeah.
like, work bag,
Yep.
right? So, like, I
Totally.
still kind of had this separation.
Yeah.
Um, I guess, thinking on it, I probably had less, like, personal things. Like, I didn't use that system for the personal side of my life. But I
Mhm.
also feel like, for kids and, like, all those extra responsibilities, I had less things that I was worried about keeping track.
For sure. Yeah. I guess what I realized as you described that with the legal pad staying at work is that I was picturing my dad, honestly, who keeps a little pocket notebook in his shirt
Oh, yeah.
pocket and a pen or
Interesting.
pencil. He hates pencil at all times, where he just like pulls it out and makes notes. And for a while, I was doing that too. Not putting it in a shirt pocket because
Yeah.
I don't wear shirt pockets. And that was, man, that was a different time where I felt like I just needed to keep track of everything, and I don't really feel like that anymore. I think I think there was some freedom that I acquired when I decided to not be Mr. Dependable.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you, like, you kind of went through that and kind of freed yourself of that. And I think, one of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier for me is, like, I'm still I'm still in that mode, and, like,
Mhm.
trying to decide if I can, or if I feel comfortable, like, trying to give myself that
Yeah,
freedom.
yeah,
Um, and, like, I think I've this is how I've been for so long that it's scary.
Yeah, it's your identity.
Right. It's
You don't want to mess with your identity.
yeah.
Man, I honestly like it feels very, very similar to what I felt like up until probably a couple years ago. So I don't. If you ever want to talk about it more, I have
I
lots of
I
feelings about it and
I
whatever.
I kind of do at some point. You know, obviously
Okay, yeah,
it's pretty late,
yeah,
but I'd be curious to pick your brain maybe and
yeah,
hear how you got through that.
yeah. If I could like summarize it in one thing, it was just it was about comparing, comparing. It's about thinking about who mattered to me the most, and in the end, it came down to I love my coworkers, but they don't matter to me as much as my family
Yeah,
does, or my wife does, or I do. And when I'm choosing to be dependable and to not drop any of these balls for anybody, I'm choosing them over myself, and I'm choosing them over my family's happiness, because when I have all that shit going on, I become a very negative person, and stressed out and crabby and whatever else. I don't know. At some point, something just like clicked for me where it became a lot easier to make decisions when I thought about who they were for.
cool. That's awesome. I appreciate that. That 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 makes a ton of sense.
Thanks for listening to this episode of a Developer Experience Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Mike Weinand. You can find Mike on LinkedIn. I'll link it in the notes. If you like the show, support it at the podcast's home, anchor.fm/a-developer-experience. I'm Steve Hicks. Check stephenhicks.me/where to find me on the internet. Take care, friends.